Yes, people, welcome to Watchdog, a MintPress podcast which examines closely organizations and policies which are in the public interest to know about. Since we're going against the grain and casting a light on stories which are largely ignored or covered in a superficial way by the mainstream corporate media, it is vital we have the public support to do this. So please support MintPress through the Patreon and help us to continue this important work. Today, for our first episode of this podcast on two important organizations that you should know about and the entryism into public institutions that they practice, we are joined by a prolific writer and researcher who focuses on intelligence, surveillance, civil liberties, and big tech on the micro and the macro level. We're joined today by Whitney Webb. Thank you, Whitney. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you today. I really wanted to basically spread the word about some of your work on this Unit 8200 in the IDF. Now, it was founded in the 50s and has an increasingly important role in public life and political life around the world. However, it seems to be a very, very well-concealed organization generally. What is Unit 8200?
So Unit 8200 is the principal signals intelligence unit of Israeli military intelligence. And as you mentioned, they're one of the older parts or components of the Israeli military intelligence apparatus. Their prominence, though, has become a lot more significant, specifically since the 90s, when Israel's government started things like the YASMA program, and the development, this work with government money, really pour a lot of funds and energy into building up Israel's high-tech sector, which has essentially, for all intents and purposes, and this is essentially admitted by the IDF and Israeli media, that the military intelligence apparatus and the high-tech sector are essentially the same for all intents and purposes, that they work so closely together that it's really hard to tell in many cases where one ends and where the other begins. This is really evident in looking at big tech hubs, specifically for cybersecurity in Israel, like the one located at Beersheba, that's also located right next. These companies are located right next door to installations of IDF military intelligence, and things like that. And they openly intersect in different ways. And this is essentially, as I mentioned, an admitted fact. This became even more pervasive in the year 2012. So in 2012, there was a policy decision that was made. It was admitted publicly until relatively recently in 2019. But essentially what was decided by Netanyahu's office was that in order to ensure that Israel remains and advances its position as the world's dominant cyber power. This is what they have been hoping to achieve. That they would start conducting operations that were previously done in-house Israeli intelligence agencies and move them to private companies, which essentially then would act as fronts, for those intelligence operations with a specific focus on the high-tech sector and cybersecurity. And just other tech startups in general. And some of those private companies already existed and were sort of co-opted as intelligence fronts then, and some were made explicitly for that purpose. So in this article in Calculus Tech that admits a lot of this stuff, quoting Israeli military officials and things like that, they admit that Black Cube was essentially created to be a privatized Mossad. And there's a couple others that we can look at their history and what they've done since and see indications that there's several of these, and many of them are actually now embedded, or their software is used by classified installations in the US, like the Department of Defense, for example, or also used by major Silicon Valley companies. So there's a lot to be said in that sense. So it's definitely very pervasive the influence of Unit 8200, because it now extends well beyond the unit of the IDF itself, and very much into the private sector, not just in Israel, but also in these multinational companies that have absorbed some of these Israeli startups that have been created by Unit 8200 alumni.
I think also the important thing is to make sure people are aware of the way that Unit 8200 functions. It often selects people at the school level and grooms them to be part of this operation. There's about 1,500 members of it, and their main focus is surveillance of Palestinians, social listening through the collection of signal intelligence data, and the interception of their communications. Essentially, that is the sort of omnipotent surveillance state which buttresses the occupation of Palestinian land. They've also been found to use social media to identify and almost algorithmatize vulnerable Palestinians in order to make them collaborators. They use a form of surveillance to predict how likely those Palestinians are to become collaborators. They blackmail them with private information about their romantic lives or about their private lives. You even had a letter written by whistleblowers within Unit 8200, or who had previously served in Unit 8200, describing what they do as a widespread surveillance of innocent civilians, claiming that while there are severe limitations on the surveillance of Israeli citizens, the Palestinians are not afforded this protection. So to think that an organization like this, as of 2012, has been siphoned into the private sphere, where it's more camouflaged in terms of its capabilities and functions, it would be great to also talk about what are some of those organizations and companies that people often take at face value as simply benign cybersecurity companies, which were either set up by Unit 8200 alumni or have a large amount of former Unit 8200 employees within it today. What are some of those organizations?
Well, there's several. Probably the best examples I can give would be one is Sepio Systems, which was co-founded by Unit 8200 members. And today, the chairman of the board is Tamer Pardo, the former director of the Mossad. Another example would be Cybereason. I did a whole series about them for MintPress last January. They were co-founded, the main founder, who's their CEO today, Lior Div, when he was in Unit 8200, was the head of their offensive hacking operations targeting nation states, because in addition to surveillance, they're also involved in offensive hacking operations, the most well-known example being Stuxnet. And of course, a lot of the recent hacks and attacks on Iranian installations or industry, or also the internet going down last February in Iran. And a lot of these other things have been conducted by Unit 8200 in the past. So I just wanted to add that really quickly. But in the case of Cybereason and Lior Div, he openly admits in an interview, I think it was with TechCrunch, that his work at Cybereason is a direct continuation of his time in Unit 8200. And that's quite, when you know that this policy exists, that's quite explicit. And Cybereason is now, running on the everything Lockheed Martin, the massive weapons contractor. They also have an IT division, or they did. It was spun off and added to another company. But that IT division was created after Lockheed Martin was suspiciously hacked. No one knows who did the hack, but some tokens linked to it were tied back to an Israeli cybersecurity company called RSA. After the hack, it gets sort of swept under the rug, so little reputational damage is done at the end of the day, and they open an office in this Beersheba hub that I previously mentioned. And soon after, they start using all of Cybereason's cybersecurity software, both in their IT division, which is mainly, even though it has this relatively new office in Beersheba, Most of those products were used in the U.S. and on, defense related installations, and that's still the case today. That division was spun off from Lockheed Martin, is now part of Leidos, which is the biggest contractor to the U.S. government in IT, and they use all of Cybereason's software.
Just for the record, Leidos were part of the census in the UK in 2021. So they were part of the group of organizations that administered the census. And of course, the census in 2010, 2011 had been entirely delivered by Lockheed Martin. So these are potentially swaths of information which are being made visible to what seems to be partisan actors. You mentioned Cybereason as being one of the organizations with this umbilical link to Unit 8200. What does Cybereason do, and what kind of information does it have access to today?
So it's a cybersecurity company. Essentially, you install their software on your network and also individual computers. And it basically runs in the background to let, reportedly, like all cybersecurity software claims to do, right? Protecting your network and your devices from outside threats and unwanted intruders and all of these different things that could cause problems on your technological devices. However, this is complicated because Israeli intelligence has a very complicated history with the U.S. in terms of espionage, going back, for example, to the Promise software scandal, where the mastermind of that was Israeli spy master Rafi Eitan. Robert Maxwell was the main salesperson for the Promise software to classified U.S. Laboratories so that Israel could spy on U.S. nuclear research. This is the same time that the Jonathan Pollard affair took place. And Rafi Eitan, again, was Jonathan Pollard's handler. So, the 1980s. The U.S. Specifically nuclear research was in military intel and classified military information was of great desire to Israel. Even though the U.S. and Israel are allies and have lots of information sharing, apparently that wasn't enough. And Jonathan Pollard, considered one of the most damaging spies in U.S. history, was apparently required, according to Israeli intelligence, and placing a backdoor into classified systems was also required. So this is something that has a long history. Of course, it didn't stop in the 1980s. There were some scandals with Israeli espionage, the art student affair, where people tied to Israeli intelligence where it came to the U.S. and were spying specifically on the Drug Enforcement Agency and other federal agencies. And then also the Amdocs Converse Infosys situation. That was actually the subject of, I think, a 3 or 4 part Fox News investigation in 2001 that is actually quite difficult to find today, but revealed the existence of a very large espionage ring, specifically targeting U.S. federal installations. And then, of course, there have been reports, several reports, that in the late 90s, Israel succeeded in tapping the phones of the White House and had a prior knowledge of the Bill Clinton-Monica Lewinsky affair and attempted to use this as leverage over Bill Clinton, which reportedly resulted in the pardoning of Mark Rich, who was a fugitive at the time and had ties to Mossad right before Clinton left office in 2001. So it's definitely not exactly, having a company tied to foreign intelligence whose CEO says his work is a direct continuation of his time in that intelligence agency, and that same intelligence apparatus has this history of espionage. It's quite astounding that this would be allowed to run on Department of Defense computers, but that is how it is. And I would like to also point out, because I forgot to mention this earlier, this 2012 policy, the main goal of it was so that the U.S. as a country, depending on who got in power or what movements came from the ground up, would never be able to meaningfully practice boycott, divest, sanctions. That's like the main stated purpose of this. And so another organization that also was created in 2012, I would argue as an extension of this, Startup Nation Central, is also has that explicit purpose and is all about getting a lot of these tech startups and other Israeli companies as well acquired by U.S. multinationals or explicitly U.S. companies with the purpose of having them so dependent on Israeli tech or the services of Israeli companies that they could never meaningfully boycott Israel for its violations of international law.
And so this organization that you've just mentioned, Startup Nation Central, was founded by the well-known, one of the top Republican donors, Paul E. Singer, who is really the ruler of the hedge fund Elliott Management. He's the founder. And
definitely the ruler. Yeah.
And this hedge fund is the majority shareholder in Arconic, the company that put the cladding on Grenfell Tower with 6 millimeters of polyethylene in the middle of it. The same company that worked with Lockheed Martin and BAE Systems on the F-35 fighter jet that hoovered up huge amounts of public funds, the most expensive military project in recorded human history. They also own a huge amount of shares in Twitter, in Waterstones, the bookshop. But Paul Singer's connection with Unit 8200 and the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in the Israeli state, if you could go into some of that for us.
So those relationships specifically, I don't have a lot of information on. I mainly, as far as Paul Singer goes, have information on Startup Nation Central, which what the idea was pitched to him by a person who works under him at Elliott Capital Management, Dan Senor, who was previously part of the successor to the Project for a New American Century with the neocons, Bob Kagan and Bill Kristol. Dan Senor was the third part of that foreign policy initiative, which was a neocon think tank. Funded largely by Paul Singer. And so Dan Senor wrote this book with a Jerusalem Post journalist called Startup Nation, where basically they said that the fusion of the civil and military sectors in Israel is why their high-tech sector is so successful. And Paul Singer was so taken with this book, he poured $20 million into the creation of Startup Nation Central, which was done in collaboration with Netanyahu's top economic advisor, Eugene Kandel, a former top individual at Amdocs, which I previously mentioned was had gotten in trouble for spying on the U.S. government in the early 2000s. And then the other person was Wendy Singer, who is Dan Senor's sister and what is the longtime head of AIPAC's Jerusalem office. So essentially they came together, and some other people on their board of directors includes a very prominent Unit 8200 figure named Raphael I think it's Uzin is how it's pronounced, who's had several prominent startups of his own that have led him to become very wealthy. And so his position on the board and Startup Nation Central's own actions in terms of promoting Unit 8200 founded companies to Silicon Valley and whatnot does suggest there is a relationship there. And of course, the timing of the founding of that organization with the launch of this policy, also by Netanyahu's office, and Paul Singer's working with Netanyahu's economic advisor and AIPAC and all this stuff, it does seem very coordinated in terms of the people involved and the purposes there. So Startup Nation Central claims to have been very instrumental in having a lot of tech startups acquired by Silicon Valley companies, specifically in the case of Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, which of course essentially dominate the tech scene in the United States and really globally to a significant degree.
So this organization, Startup Nation Central, was set up with the explicit purpose of combating BDS by directing tech jobs to the state of Israel. But also you have the other situation where former Unit 8200 employees then go into big tech companies also. Yes. So we'll get onto how that potentially relates to censorship or pro-Palestinian voices online. But I also wanted to ask you, when thinking about these organizations which are linked to Unit 8200 in this way, you've written about an organization called the Cyber Threat Intelligence League. Could you tell us about that organization?
Yeah, sure. So they called themselves the Justice League of Cyberspace, essentially. They popped up shortly after the coronavirus crisis began in earnest globally, I think around April of last year or so, if I remember correctly. They basically went around offering free cybersecurity services to U.S. hospitals and critical infrastructure, and have since expanded to include dams, nuclear reactors, and lots of things that are obviously concerning, in my opinion anyway, and I think maybe in some other people's opinion as well, I would hope, because this organization is composed of volunteers, and there is no publicly available list of who those volunteers are. You can be added to this group by being approved by any one of the four co-founders, two of which are Microsoft employees, with one has a background in like naval intelligence in the US. The other one is a self-described gray hat hacker, which means a cybersecurity professional that may not or may violate laws and ethical norms, but without malicious intent. So you can take that for, whatever that means. I just don't understand why people are using this service. And the other person is a guy at the cybersecurity firm Okta. One of Okta's main investors, or I think their main investor, is this venture capital firm Entryism, which very, very much likes to invest in companies started up by Ehud Barak, the former head of Israeli military intelligence and the former prime minister of Israel, and as we know now, great pal of Jeffrey Epstein. Andreessen Horowitz has invested heavily in his firm Toka, which basically sells software to governments and law enforcement around the world that claims to be able to hack any device anywhere at all. And it's honestly probably should be illegal. But anyway.
And also Ohad Zaidenberg also.
Oh, right. Sorry, I was getting there. Yeah, sorry. So the original founder of CTI League is Ohad Zaidenberg, and he's definitely the one to pay attention to there. He's a self-described former award-winning commander in Unit 8200, very high-level figure. At the time, he focused specifically on Iran. During his time in Unit 8200, he has since formally left Unit 8200, but through his different associations, including at this research facility he's at that's affiliated with Tel Aviv University. He works directly with the Israeli government every day, and that is led by the current head of, or the former head of the Intelligence Analysis Division of the IDF. And then he also works for Clear Sky Cybersecurity, which was created by the developer of Israel's government's e-government platform, and openly collaborates with state-owned Israeli tech and Israeli defense manufacturers all the time, and and Zaidenberg is the main threat intelligence person there. And over the course of his career there, has blamed pretty much every hack possible on Iran. Surprise. Without providing any public evidence, essentially saying things like, oh, well, the person tied to this operation, we believe, used to work in Iran, and therefore I can say with medium to high probability the Iranian government was behind this. And then he won't release any evidence as to why he holds that belief. It's just basically reported verbatim in outlets like Reuters or Forbes or some of these other mainstream media outlets. And this is actually a problem, a very persistent problem in reporting on cyber attacks and cyber in general. And of course, the increase in cyber attacks recently, this has obviously greater and graver consequences than ever before. But Microsoft as well, and the two Microsoft individuals that are behind CTI League have also done this, essentially saying, oh, this hack was perpetrated by this actor because we believe, this, or we believe that, but they won't publicly say why. Or they'll say, oh, this group was behind this hack, and we believe this group is Iran, and they won't say why, and stuff like that. So it's all very they very much obfuscate their reasons for attributing those things, and they have these conflicts of interest, specifically Zadenberg and saying it's Iran, and things like that. And of course, now they're by protecting all of this critical infrastructure for free, we're told they also have access to all of that data. And so particularly Zadenberg, this is very problematic because he could just be passing this data to a foreign intelligence service or a foreign government, and we don't really know. He openly collaborates with them in other ways. He could easily approve volunteers that are affiliated or still even active members of this foreign intelligence service or foreign government, giving them access to people's health data, for example, among other things. And we do know that there are a lot of intelligence-linked companies at present over the course of COVID-19 that have sought to amass as much health data as possible for their own ends and to develop their own products. Palantir, being a good example of that, running both, amassing all and basically holding all of the COVID-19 data for both the US and the UK, and they're deeply tied to the CIA. So this is something that foreign, that intelligence-linked entities are actively doing. So to think that, the CTI League wouldn't do this, I think is honestly kind of naive. They collaborate openly with some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, including Pfizer and Gilead. And they were actually, Ohad Zadenberg was actually the source behind the claim that Iran had hacked Gilead last year. And this, at the time, the Trump administration was very reportedly angry about this and deemed it cyber retaliation after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and all of this stuff. But there was no actual publicly or no evidence given to actually assign it to Iran. It was just, let's take Ohad Zadenberg's word for it, a guy that's dedicated his whole career to targeting Iran as an intelligence threat and all of this stuff. And this is also significant, I should add as well, because Israeli intelligence pretty openly for several decades has even like Meir Dagan, the former head of Mossad, said on US television that it was policy to try and get the U.S. to attack Iran first so that Israel wouldn't have to. So having these people in this position with these conflicts of interest and running on this critical infrastructure, which we've been told by mainstream media, they've seeded the narrative that those are the exact installations that Iran and China and the bad guys want to hack. It's just a very unfortunate situation. So, if those things are hacked and then blame on Iran, it's worth asking, was CTI League involved in this or not? And, it remains to be seen what will happen. But again, this is obviously not good policy. And a lot of these hospitals, for example, that have taken CTI League up on their offer did so because they had a lot of their funding cut, even as the COVID-19 crisis was beginning. They had funding cut and had to make cuts to their IT department. This group sweeps in to save the day, offering them services for free and then gaining access to all of their data and all of their systems.
So just to summarize what we have a state like Israel, which exists in a state of permanent war with the indigenous population, the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. It creates a surveillance infrastructure which makes every corner, which is sort of invisible through its ubiquity. It makes every corner of Palestinian life visible to this military juggernaut. Now, a key unit which is developed to surveil that population is basically exported in 2012 into private companies around the world. Mm-hmm. Ohad Zadenberg is symptomatic of hundreds, if not possibly in the thousands.
Yeah, we don't know how many there are. And that's why this is a really problematic issue, and it doesn't get enough attention. And you think it would, because it's foreign intelligence people being involved in things they shouldn't be, and specifically in efforts to basically merge Israel's in the American national security state, basically creating a binational security state apparatus so that they can obviously combine their power and also target, pro-Palestinian activists in those countries, which of course in recent years have been, growing in numbers and much more vocal because of what's been going on in occupied Palestine. And of course, the support of governments like the US and the UK. Israel's government deems that essential to allowing their occupation to continue. They can't afford to lose that support. And that's where these policies come from, out of a place of fear that people will eventually demand that Israel be held accountable for its violations of international law. And this is a very extreme way to go about it. Obviously, but it's consistent with what we have seen from Israeli intelligence for decades, unfortunately.
But also it serves several purposes. So one of the purposes that exporting these Unit 8200 people into private companies does is it fights BDS. It also gives Israel access to swaths of information about really important and strategic locations in other states. But also, as you seem to just imply, whether it is through building up panic around cyber attacks of states which are targeted by the military industrial complex, it also acts to apply pressure to the US government to project military power in those directions also.
Mm-hmm.
But
right.
it also works simultaneously in tandem, and I think even just in this conversation, we've uncovered a visibility that now the British public has to particular actors through Leidos, and through Leidos having involvement in the census in 2021 in this country. Recently, in the last few days, we saw a report, of course, reproduced uncritically, that Iranian actors, and this is the exact way in which it is referenced in the stories, organization believed to be linked to Iran, hacked SOAS, the University of London, the emails of academics, and sent emails from those academics impersonating them to think tank people and journalists in the United States. Now, it seems like quite a silly exercise of your time if you were the Iranian state. What would you seek to gain by sending these emails to journalists and people from think tanks and impersonating academics? Well, I checked out what the source is for this story, and it's a cybersecurity company called Proofpoint, and that's all it is presented as in the news coverage. This is just a benign cybersecurity company. But when you look a little bit closely at who's employed in the company, you have high-ranking figures. You have Senior Director of Security Research there. Roe Cohen Dweck is the former IDF Intelligence Corps Technological Unit. You have the Senior Director of Research and Development, R&D agent, formerly from the IDF. You have tens, if not 100 people employed in this organization who are from the IDF, many of them from Unit 8200. And so questions have to be asked about partiality of this organization in this context. And so what we're trying to do, partly through this podcast and others, is to build that literacy in the general public about the information that they are receiving, where it is coming from, and ways in which it could potentially be coming from heavily partisan actors. Mm-hmm. I think one of the great things about your look at Startup Nation Central and Paul E. Singer was the passage where you had identified, this was about 2 years ago, you had identified 28 former Unit 8200 people working in Google, some of them in very important positions, it seems, around 13 working in Facebook, and quite a few working in Microsoft. You know, what Microsoft's relationship with Israeli militarism is well established and has been gone into at length by Mondoweiss and others. But what is the potential relevance of Unit 8200 workers in these big tech companies and the censorship that we have seen visited upon pro-Palestinian people in the most recent war in Gaza.
Right. So when you have Unit 8200, so this 2012 policy I mentioned, right? So there's these organizations that are being used as fronts and companies that are being used by fronts. But if they're going to do that, there's really not that much stopping them from using someone, as a separate example, like Ohad Zaydenberg, as someone who continues a lot of those same objectives even after he's formally left the service. So unfortunately, that background in foreign intelligence and the history of this foreign intelligence agency and espionage targeting the U.S. and trying to get the U.S. to go to war with various nations to the benefit of Israel and not the U.S., presents a conflict of interest when you're having these companies, specifically in the case of Microsoft and Google, that not only dominate a lot of internet traffic or consumer tech products, but are also major contractors for the US government. And more often than, well, in the case of Microsoft specifically, there's a lot of controversy there, specifically regarding the relationship between Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein, how that actually goes back to the 1990s. And there's considerable indication that during that period, Israel, their highest executive levels as a company, were compromised by the same network that Epstein was working for, which of course is tied to Israeli intelligence. So you have hiring decisions that are made during that time that could be made because of this blackmail. And as you mentioned earlier, when just describing how Unit 8200 has operated since the 50s, blackmail has been one of their most prominent tools that they've used both in the Palestinian territories, but they've also used it elsewhere. Of course, Jeffrey Epstein, as an Israeli intelligence asset, was in the business of collecting blackmail against people, but a lot of it was being done with Silicon Valley and with tech companies. So what would they use that blackmail for? It would be quite reasonable to assume that some of that would be to get their people or people that would follow the agendas they want them to follow into prominent positions, prominent management positions where they can direct, that company to do things that this intelligence agency would like them to do. And more often than not, as we mentioned earlier, a lot of these policies revolve around essentially neutering the ability of BDS to meaningfully establish itself in the United States or some of these other countries. It's reasonable to assume that these people could easily follow that, and we don't actually know. So, it does represent a conflict of interest there, but this isn't really something that is talked about at all because, some people will be like, oh, well, you're just saying that because they're Israeli and anti-Semitism and whatnot. But no, it's because these are people that previously worked for a foreign intelligence agency, the documented history of espionage, of blackmail, and also, trying to censor pro-Palestinian voices or voices that they don't agree with or that are saying things counter to their agendas and their policies. So I think that's an important distinction to make there. And I do want to point out that there are some people that are particularly important to point out here. So like in the case of Microsoft, their entire cloud system was essentially developed by Unit 8200 graduates led by Asaf Rappaport, who later went on to lead Microsoft's Research and Development Center in Israel, which does almost like a significant amount of Microsoft's R&D in general, and led that for several years. And, he's been quite controversial because of how his ties to that intelligence agency and the same model of people like Ohad Zaydenberg or Lior Div have remained consistent well after he left that unit. And of course, Microsoft's cloud is used by businesses all over the world. It only recently lost the cloud contract for the Pentagon, the whole U.S. Department of Defense as a whole. So these are things with massive implications. So the social media side of it with Facebook and, the search engine side of it with like Google and Microsoft is definitely significant. But you have to also look at, their other services that they provide, not just to regular people and regular political discourse, but also to prominent powerful businesses, and also to government entities, defense entities, national security entities, in all of this. And unfortunately, the inability to have a discussion about these policies that we know to exist, that they have admitted exist, and these different companies involved, and the extent to which Unit 8200 alumni operate in prominent positions within the United States, it prevents us from really knowing the extent of the influence they have, how they use that influence. I mean, there's never been an investigation to it, obviously, because it's not even something that mainstream media is willing to talk about.
Well, I think you've quite smoothly brought us on when thinking about the parameters of public discussion around the state of Israel, which are imposed on people both in the United States and in Britain, directly relates to the next organization that I'd like to get into, who also have been adopted by YouTube as a trusted flagger for content could be deemed, or has been deemed by them, to be racist. We're talking about the organization, the Anti-Defamation League. Now, this organization was spying on Arab student groups, anti-racist student groups, prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. We know that there was a level of collaboration with the FBI prior to the official call in 1968 by the FBI to all of its branches to cooperate directly with the Anti-Defamation League. This is an organization which states that its aim is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. It does this through new programs, policies, and skills to expose and combat whatever holds us back. Now, despite the fact that the FBI were officially cooperating with the ADL from 1968, you had an internal memo in the FBI in 1969, which put it this way, that it's very possible that this organization, and I'm quoting directly, represents a violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act as amended. It is incredible to assume that this organization is not furnished to an official of the government of Israel. Now, this is quite serious. What we're saying here is that the FBI suspected the ADL of being a proxy of the State of Israel, of directly working with the Israeli government. It was infiltrating Arab student groups. It was infiltrating pro-Palestinian groups in the United States. But unfortunately, since that point, we've seen an escalation of FBI collaboration with the ADL, and this is the entryism that we're talking about, to the point where today the ADL is the largest non-governmental trainer of law enforcement in the United States. There's a revolving door, incestuous relationship between these two organizations. And according to the director of the FBI, James Comey, their relationship is closer than it has ever been at any point in history. Can you tell us about the ADL and this relationship with law enforcement in the United States and how that affects people?
Sure. So a couple things I want to add straight off from the bat. So the ADL, and during that point you mentioned, was spying on Arab student groups, but by the early 90s, this had expanded to include groups like Greenpeace, environmental groups, and just groups that were supportive of the end of apartheid of South Africa, and were actually caught by the FBI despite their cozy relationship of sending that information both to Mossad and to the apartheid government of South Africa. So they were essentially operating in that capacity as an intelligence agency, essentially posing as a civil rights organization. And this is very controversial for various reasons. So the ADL, what's important to know about them, their founding as an organization runs very counter to their stated reason for existing. So In Marietta, Georgia, there was the murder of, I think, a 13-year-old girl named Mary Fagan it was found by a court, a unanimous verdict, which included Jewish members, by the way. So you can't really argue that it was an anti-Semitic jury that convicted Leo Frank, but he was found guilty of raping and murdering this girl. Several character witnesses that worked around that factory that Leo Frank was running, where this girl worked, said that he was a pervert and that he was interested in young girls, that he was essentially a pedophile. His legal team was accused of bribery, all of these very under the table acts in an attempt to get him acquitted. They did not succeed. They attempted to appeal numerous times. At the time this murder was committed, Leo Frank was the chapter head, I think the Atlanta chapter head of an organization called B'nai B'rith, which is essentially sort of like a free Masonic style organization, but its membership is exclusive to people that are Jewish. So basically, B'nai B'rith is the parent organization of the ADL. And after Leo Frank was sent to prison, he was he was sentenced to death by hanging originally. His legal team managed to get that reduced to life in prison. People in the community were outraged and kidnapped him from prison and lynched him for the crime that he had committed against this young girl, because it got a lot of attention in the press, because he had actually there had been an effort to frame African-American individuals for the crime. And it's a very scandalous court case. I would encourage people to go look at it. But essentially, B'nai B'rith created the ADL in order to rehabilitate Leo Frank's image, which they have since done through documentaries and other things, and tried to rebrand what happened in that situation as having been the result of anti-Semitism and not the result of evidence linking this particular individual to the crime. And like even today, the ADL is still trying to get a pardon of Leo Frank, despite the fact that this took place like over 100 years ago, back in 1913. Essentially, you could argue, based on that origin story, that the ADL essentially works as sort of a branch of B'nai B'rith, its parent organization. It frames itself as a charity group, sort of as a civil rights organization. But if you look at this example of its founding, more often than not, in practice, it seems to be about protecting the interests of B'nai B'rith or its members. And of course, B'nai B'rith is an organization that is much older than the state of Israel itself, and has various controversies within the United States going back to the 19th century and the Civil War. So, in the years after this, some of the main founders and most prominent members of B'nai B'rith were people like the Bronfman family, which, if you're familiar with my work on the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, you will know that the Bronfmans have very deep established ties to organized crime. And a lot of these billionaires that are part of the so-called mega group with the Bronfmans, that group of billionaires being formerly co-founded by Leslie Wexner and Charles Bronfman in the early 90s. But those same billionaires, before they formally got together and created their group and gave themselves a name, were the main contributors to the Anti-Defamation League in the period leading up to this formal creation of the mega group, with the Bronfmans definitely being one of those. One of the presidents of B'nai B'rith, actually, during the period that Leo Frank, that whole situation took place, and the creation of the ADL took place, their most prominent chapter was and has always been the one in New York. And that was actually led by Albert Cohn, the father of Roy Cohn, who, of course, we know was like Trump's lawyer and very involved with organized crime as well. And also involved, if you read my Epstein series, with sexual blackmail and things like that, but was heavily honored by B'nai B'rith throughout the 1980s and showered with all these awards by them and things like this. So the ADL has had some ties with those groups, obviously, through its relationship with B'nai B'rith and the funding it's received from a lot of these individuals, wealthy individuals whose families have historic ties to organized crime and, are, for all intents and purposes, really the successors of the National Crime Syndicate that was led by Mayor Lansky in the earlier part of of the 20th century. And of course, those same individuals like Mayor Lansky and a lot in the Bronfmans and all of that were very involved in arming Zionist paramilitaries before the founding of the State of Israel, and very involved in efforts to see Israel be created as a country in 1948, and subsequently had ties with both U.S. and Israeli intelligence. So what we see later with their union in a way with the FBI is that it sort of started off small in the civil rights era, because they were heavily funded and were able to really get in front of other civil rights groups because of that funding. And so that helped secure them access in this way. Because, if you know how the US government works, it tends to be that way. That, as you mentioned, and what you said earlier, those ties have only expanded, but so has the ADL's influence. Not just because of the FBI, but other things. But these ties with the FBI are very significant now, because the FBI, through what the Biden administration has launched with its new domestic terror strategy, if you actually read that strategy, it says anyone who's deemed anti-authority or anti-government or extremist for a variety of reasons. It includes qualifiers that obviously include both groups on the left and the right. Before that strategy came out earlier this year, there was a hearing in front of Congress by DHS and the FBI at the end of February, and the theme was about essentially launching a war on domestic terror, but focused on anti-Semitic domestic terror. And the FBI openly said then that they were essentially being told that individuals and groups were being flagged by the ADL to the FBI to be pursued as domestic terrorists. And now that this strategy has been formalized, memos, at least one memo has come out listing the ADL as among these organizations that are flagging individuals based on their social media history or social media comments and all of this as being worth pursuing as quote unquote domestic terrorists. By the way, at that hearing, they talk about domestic terrorism that's anti-Semitic extremists on the left and the right that are united by anti-Semitism and all of this. So it's they have a very prominent role in this up and coming war on domestic terror, which is very disconcerting when you look at their history, their funding, their past role in espionage, and their targeting specifically of Arab American groups, because they claim to want to promote, free, fair treatment for all races and ethnicities and sexual orientations and whatnot. But it hasn't been that way historically. If you look at their actions, they actually refuse to teach, to even discuss in their anti-bias training, gay rights and things like that. For several decades, they outright refused to include that, saying it wasn't, part of their national values and things like that. So, they haven't exactly always done the things that they profess to do. And the fact that they have all this power now in terms of, specifically in terms of this domestic terror apparatus is concerning, because they essentially, and this has been said by many groups, not just me, have acted as essentially an arm of the Israel lobby. And with these other efforts to target BDS through Unit 8200 and other things, can BDS activists be labeled extremists or domestic terrorists? How far does that go? Having this group there being able to flag individuals for this purpose based on their social media posts is really concerning. And this is also concerning because the Anti-Defamation League runs their so-called hate lab out of Silicon Valley. And that's how, for example, they became one of the trusted flaggers of YouTube and all of that. The funding for that was set up by Craig Newmark, the guy behind Craigslist, and Piero Midyar, the founder of eBay, current owner of PayPal, and the creator and funder of the Intercept outlet. So essentially, the ADL has been given this power to decide what is hate speech on the internet and what is not. And now by the federal government, they've essentially been given this power to say who is an extremist and who isn't. And this is, given the group's history, obviously not a good way to go. I think that should be pretty clear.
Yeah, I mean, they've been involved in the campaign against Ilhan Omar, against Mark Lamont Hill, against Linda Sarsour. What is the relevance of them enlisting the former FBI official Gregory Ehery as the vice president for law enforcement and analysis. This was a figure who, while working for the FBI, spent a year on a kibbutz in Jerusalem learning Arabic. You look at them hiring George Salim as the director of anti-bias education programs. This was one of the core architects of the Department of Homeland Security's countering violent extremism program. You also look at the appointment on the other side of Mayorkas as the head of domestic homeland security. What do these crossovers and these revolving door relationships tell us about the extent to which the ADL is entrenched within the FBI and vice versa?
So if you look at the ADL as an extension of the Israel lobby or working on behalf of Israel's government, it's sort of similar to what I mentioned earlier with Unit 8200, this effort to create a binational security state. So the ADL is working on through those hirings and this revolving door between law enforcement, specifically the FBI, DHS, and the ADL, does that for those organizations. This is really to allow the merging of the national security states of Israel and the U.S. to ensure that their agendas and practices are the same and that they, pursue and maintain Israel's interests. But there's, of course, other Israel lobby organizations that advance this as well, like JINSA. Another Israel lobby organization specifically works on taking prominent U.S. military officials on trips to Israel and embedding them with the IDF and sort of fostering that directly between the U.S. military and the IDF. This occurs on multiple levels throughout the U.S. government, and I would argue that the end goal is essentially the same. But what's troubling specifically with the FBI and DHS and the ADL is that the FBI and DHS are the domestic intelligence agencies of the U.S., essentially like how Shin Bet operates in occupied Palestine. And so in the same way that Palestine, domestic dissidents have been targeted by Shin Bet for their views and their advocacy, this opens up the potential for those same types of advocates in the U.S. To also be targeted for their speech and for their activism, which is obviously a very slippery slope. And if efforts are successful to embroil the U.S. in a conflict with Iran and stuff, this could easily ramp up to a significant degree when you have this extreme merging of the national security states of Israel and the U.S. Targeting opponents of the war or military aggression or intervention and things like that. When it's in the interest of Israel and the United States, they tend to go quite hard over domestic dissidents, and the fact that we have this new in the U.S. this strategy about domestic terror specifically, obviously raises concerns there, because every time this has been attempted, whether it was after 9/11 or after the Oklahoma City bombing or now after January 6th, they're essentially the legislation that follows those events by and large is aimed at just gutting civil liberties, gutting things like habeas corpus, posse comitatus, and things that prevent the U.S. from sliding into a military dictatorship. And so essentially, I would argue, the thing that got Paul Singer's attention so much with Startup Nation Central, Dan Senor's praise of Israel's civil military fusion concept. There's sort of this effort to do that in the U.S. to a degree. And so you have the ADL, which is technically a civil organization, a civil rights organization. They say having so much control over national security policy as it relates to homeland defense. This is really significant and something that more people should be talking about. But unfortunately, it's very difficult to criticize the ADL and allow that information to get out widely, specifically because of how much control they have over online discourse. And their influence now over what constitutes extremism, and how with the domestic terror strategy, being accused of extremism can lead to very real world consequences.
And, the ADL attempt to define Zionism as an expression of Jewish civil rights. But the important thing emphasize again and again and again is that Zionism was always a minority movement, even till today. You look at the first World Zionist Congress taking place in the late 1800s. Originally, the plan of Theodor Herzl and others that founded the Zionist movement was that it would take place in Germany. However, this was opposed aggressively by the German Union of Rabbis, and so it had to take place in Switzerland instead. Today, we're in a situation where around 15 to 16 million Jewish people in the world, you only have around 6 million of them as Israeli citizens. So clearly, this attempt to define Jewish people as somehow represented by what is a minority movement which claims to act in Jewish people's name. Even the person that coined the phrase Zionism, Nathan Birnbaum, later became an anti-Zionist. So the general lawfare strategy across the board, and it seems a lot of the tech companies have at least informally, at least unofficially, adopted this definition of anti-Semitism, that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism. You would find the very person who coined the phrase Zionism as somehow being defined as an anti-Semite as well. So it's really important, off the back of all of the vital information you've given us, to really be steadfast and clear in asserting Palestinian rights as an anti-racist position, to think critically about the organizations that are pushing this agenda hard, and continue to investigate those organizations. Whitney Webb, thank you so much for joining us today on the Watchdog.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you.